Hello, welcome to another Black History Moment, reading from Black Saga. 1712. New York denies slaves access to courts. Slaves were denied access to ordinary courts and other judicial processes. The traditional guarantees of English law did not pertain to slaves, which was also the case in the southern colonies. South Carolina adopts model slave code. South Carolina introduced the basic slave code written by the English for Barbados in 1688. It was revised in 1739 and several times thereafter until slavery was abolished. The code became the model that other English colonies adopted and modified. The slave code included the following provisions. Baptism in the Christian faith does not alter the status of the slave. Slaves are forbidden to leave the owner's property without written permission unless accompanied by a white person. Every white person in the community is charged to chastise promptly any slave apprehended without such a pass to leave the owner's property. Any person enticing a slave to run away and any slave attempting to leave the province receives the death penalty as punishment. Any slave absconding or successfully evading capture for 20 days is to be publicly whipped for the first offense, branded with the letter R on the right cheek for the second offense, and lose one ear if absent 30 days for the third offense. And for the fourth offense, a male slave is to be castrated. A female slave is to be whipped, branded on the left cheek with the letter R, and lose her left ear. Owners refusing to abide by the slave code or inflict specified punishment are to be fined and forfeit ownership of their slaves. The slave owner is obligated to pay the sum of £4 for all fugitives returned to the owner, dead or alive, by the commander of any patrol company. Slave houses are to be searched every fortnight for weapons and stolen goods. For theft, the owner must punish the slave by whippings, and for each additional theft, the punishment escalates: loss of one ear, branding, and nose slitting, and for the fourth offense, death. No owner shall be punished if a slave dies under punishment. Intentional killing of a slave shall cost the owner a £50 fine. No slave shall be allowed to work for pay, to plant corn, peas, or rice, to keep hogs, cattle, or horses, to own or operate a boat, to buy or sell or to wear clothes finer than ordinary Negro cloth. The following revisions were made in 1739. No slave shall be taught to write, work on Sunday, or work more than 15 hours per day in summer and 14 hours in winter. Willful killing of a slave exacts a fine of 700 pounds and passion killing 350 pounds. The fine for concealing runaway slaves is $1,000 and a prison sentence of up to 1 year. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed for employing any black or slave as a clerk. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed on anyone selling or giving alcoholic beverages to slaves. A fine of $100 and 6 months in prison are imposed for teaching a slave to read and write, and death is the penalty for circulating incendiary literature. Manumissions are forbidden except by deed, and after 1820 only by permission of the legislator. Georgia required legislative approval after 1801. In 1770, Georgia adopted the South Carolina Slave Code, and then Florida adopted the Georgia Code. Slavery in those colonies produced the most abusive aspects of the system, perhaps because in each of them slaves outnumbered whites, and the fear of insurrections and conspiracies was great. Also, plantations in these colonies had the highest rate of owner absenteeism, and overseers thus exercised enormous abusive power. Unhealthy conditions for slaves were frequently ignored because there was little contact between slaves and owners. Overall, the laws were severe, and the owner's power over the slave was boundless. Other modifications of the South Carolina Slave Code of 1712 and 1739 were made, often in response to specific circumstances that emerged over time. The adoption of another restriction by one colony led others to adopt it as a preventive or precautionary statute. For example, the Georgia Code of 1770 forbade more than 6 slaves from assembling at any place without the presence of a white person. It also imposed the death penalty for insurrection, rape, murder, poisoning, burglary, arson, and assault upon a white person. All Southern colonies denied due process of law to slaves. Blacks did not enjoy the benefits of jury trial, testimony of witnesses, or counsel. No court records were kept. These conditions allowed for hasty judgments based on insufficient evidence, effectively denying justice to the slave. The slave codes in the tobacco colonies, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina, were somewhat different from those modeled after the South Carolina Code. Here, the model was first implemented in Virginia. Slave insurrection in the New York City. On April 7th and 8th, a slave revolt in New York City killed 9 whites. On July 4th, at least 12 slaves were executed, hanged, or burned for their participation, and 6 others committed suicide before they were brought to the gallows. It is alleged that 27 armed slaves had set fire to a white man's outhouse and that when whites attempted to extinguish the fire, they were shot by the slaves. The state militia was called out to capture the fleeing slaves. In response to this and other attempted revolts in New York City, the Catechism School for Negroes at Trinity Church was closed because slave owners feared that the school's French founder, Elias No, was inciting blacks to revolt, or that education of blacks in itself would inspire riots. More restrictive slave codes were enacted, and the number of slave crimes punishable by death increased. Conspiracy to murder was made a capital offense. Slave importation prohibited in Pennsylvania. On June 7th, Pennsylvania passed a law preventing importation of slaves into the colony by imposing a duty of 20 pounds per head. The law was repealed in England. Another unsuccessful attempt to control the slave trade in Pennsylvania was made in 1715 when the Assembly imposed a 5-pound duty on each slave imported. This law was also disallowed in England. Thank you for listening to this Black History Moment.